Hi, my name is Angela Chavez, the Communications Director at Courage, California, and you're listening to a special edition of Courage. It looks good on you. The last time we met, we had a conversation about criminal justice and community safety that focused on the notion that hurt people hurt people. In today's episode, we're exploring the role that healing plays in criminal justice and community safety in California's communities. Be sure to listen till the end for information and resources about community healers. And remember, you can always connect with us by tagging @CourageCA and using the hashtag #CourageLooksGoodOnYou. Before I pass the mic over to today's guests, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our presence on the traditional and unceded territory of hundreds of First Nations who are the traditional caretakers of the land that we call California. And now, for Criminal Justice and Community Safety, Part 2. Healed people heal people.
Thank you both for joining. Would you like to start with some introductions and some background about who you both are?
So name is Grisanti, also go by Gris, and I use she and they pronouns. There's a few things that I do, but I think I really want to start with lineage and just who am I the daughter of? So I'm the daughter of Florencia Belén Avendaño, a Oaxacan Zapotec immigrant from Southern Mexico, and the strongest woman I know that raised me. And so in regards to like, what do? I do a lot of stuff. So I think I always kind of like sum it up. I really just call myself a space holder. And I think we all are in different ways. I think we all kind of hold space for ourselves, hold space for each other. So I'm the Healing Justice Director for a youth organizing network. I'm also a coach for Healing Justice and Liberation. And I'm also the firekeeper for the Central Valley Healing Collective. So that's, a little bit of who I am, but I always like to say that I'm just a human that's trying to figure it out, just like we all are.
Yeah, whole rounded. I'm also a human trying to figure it out. So I appreciate Grisanti kind of giving game on that. I'm totally going to piggyback that. My name is Gede. I'm Ethiopian, very specifically born in the northern region called Tigray. Came to the States when I was 5 with my mom and 2 siblings and my father. We came at a time where we were classified as refugees. So, I identify as a refugee. I identify as an immigrant. My fancy title, if there is such a thing, is I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Simply put, I'm a therapist doing therapy things, I guess, and hold space and container in my private practice. I've been in private practice now, 5 years. The most recent 2.5 years or so, I've been on my own. Outside of that, I was a part of a group practice. And I see a little bit of everybody, if you can believe it or not. And I think part of that is just my global experience, just kind of walking around being a person. I don't necessarily have a specific, what folks call population and demographics, but if I'm being honest, my heart is with boys, men, elders, specifically Black and African boys, and figuring out what wellness is for us and what it means to us. So a lot of my work really is that here in the Valley. So a little bit about me.
Thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Can you kind of define how the intersections of your identities play into community healing justice?
I first got involved in what we call movement work. Those of us in the movement, I think those of us out of the movement, like advocacy, social justice work, was really when there was a lot of deportations that were happening. I think it was really nationally, but it really hit Fresno, particularly in my neighborhood, where someone would go out for a pizza and next thing you knew, we were getting a call that they had been detained. And we needed to figure out a way to really support them, get them out of detention, somehow get them back. A lot of times they were actually running from something back home. That was my mom's experience. I also grew up in a household where there was a lot of domestic violence, and we never really got the support from the police that we were looking for. So in my neighborhood, it was always, we called the police, they came. It always seemed like they took my father on a joyride and then they brought him right back. It was never the support we needed. So we were always on the run. We were always living like in different couches of different family members, some folks that didn't even know who we were, but would give us shelter, right, from that experience. So, and I think the intersection is really that who showed up for us. It was really like other community members, so other folks that also experienced that or had the privilege that we didn't have. So we were undocumented for most of my childhood up until my late 20s. Is when we became documented, and we actually, as we were helping DACA recipients, so folks that were able to get a work permit that got here at a young age that were undocumented, we actually realized we have always qualified for a U visa. And it was the lack of our case managers, right, that didn't tell us that we actually qualified for that. And it was also until then where my mom actually like told us a story that when she tried to get help from our local women's shelter, they actually couldn't help her because none of us were documented. So it was just like how things were back then, right? Even that has shifted today, but that was really the experience of my mom, making it hard for undocumented folks, right, to really get away from circumstances like that and really seeing what that intersection was always that ICE was always around apart from the police. In South Fresno, which is where we grew up, they were never like in North Fresno, but they were always here in our neighborhood. And I think it was also just an interesting thing because the neighborhood where I grew up, this is when a local gang was really strong in our neighborhood. And
can I ask what year this was?
What year? So I got here in 1995. So I think the deportations really started heightening when I was in high school. So this was back in 2004. So about like 2004 to about like 2012 when I first started getting involved in really taking part in direct action. And what I mean by that is walking into the sheriff's office, walking into the police department, blocking ICE buses throughout California, and really asking for that change that I think as a child, I always felt that we needed. And as a child, I actually didn't know I was undocumented until I was in my 20s, where we actually realized that we actually were undocumented and things were going to be harder for us to access than some of my cousins who were like documented and they visited like our town back home every summer. Good day, if you want to add anything.
For me, I don't know that I had an intersection per se, like in justice work. I think it was more for me like lived experience, like life was very real. As being an Ethiopian, I lived in a very like private, secluded community, but a community that provided for itself. We learned the game, meaning we knew and understood what the resources were and we tapped into them. And then we got creative about how we use those resources. You know what I'm saying? So I'd say for me, it's lived experience, but then I think it's also my home. So my mom is the cook in the community. Ethiopians were huge on like coffee and food and really breaking bread with each other that way. You know, it's like literally a big plate of food and everybody's sitting around. And what I learned and experienced was my home was the hub for like resourcing. So grew up in a family of 6 siblings and then my parents, but there was always a room for anybody that was coming from the continent, right? Like regardless of who, what, where, when, why, there's always this space there. And temporarily that space was, listen, like, here's how you settle into life. Here are the resources that come with that. Interesting enough, too, part of that resourcing was like, I came from a community where we created our own community fund, right? So, the joke in our community is there's no such thing as like insurance policies because our folks are the insurance policy, right? Like we build dollar by dollar and really help. So not only was my home like the resource for like food and shelter, but it was also like a hub for like finances. Whatever folks needed reasonably, the community would come together and take care of those things. And I'm sure we'll talk about this kind of down the road in the podcast, but survival is a real thing. So for me, this idea of crime is more of a symptom, you know what I'm saying, of survival. So I learned within my community how to survive, right? To take care of the basics first and then approach life as you're taking care of the survival needs.
Yeah, I can relate to both of those stories. I grew up in a multi-generational household in an unincorporated town in Southern California, Riverside County. My whole family is that way. It's like very much the resource hub. You drop something off at grandma's house, you know it's going to go somewhere it needs to go. So the frame of community care and people coming together and neighbors and communities having their own safety nets, I think is something that aligns us in this movement work and how we carry ourselves in the world. That's definitely a value that I learned through my family and community. How did you begin working in this space that you're in now? How are you guided in current eras?
For me, I feel like I'm adjunct to the work, Grisanti's work in terms of the community justice piece. And I really view therapy, mental health, mental wellness, whatever we want to call it, like an adjunct piece. So how I've entered this space in terms of community justice and just healing work is opening up shop and solely focusing on our people. You know what I mean? And making sure that we have like quality, affordable, accessible therapy services. So for me, my lane in space really is therapy. And I feel like I'm just at one of the wheels connected to the work.
I think where it really started, it was really seeing all the struggles that my mom would do just to get us to like the May Day March. We had to take 3 buses to get downtown to get to the May Day March, or we would walk for an hour, or we would like take a taxi and we'd pay like $30 because none of us drove at that time. And I think slowly that's really like where it started for me. I think where healing justice really became a center point was when I was the lead organizer for Californians for Justice, mainly working with Southwest Fresno students, majority Black, some Latino, and most queer folks that were really coming into our office. And it was the constant pain and grief and sadness and the way they were treated in school, most of them also in the foster care system as well. And just really seeing the need for healing as we're pushing for policies. In this case, I was really working on education policies with Fresno Unified, also with State of California. And we started to notice just what our young people needed and also what I needed. Right? What was the work that I needed to step into to actually work like on my own healing journey if I was going to be in movement work for a long time? I think a constant pattern or something we always hear from organizers is I did it for 3 years or I did it for 2 years and like I burned out. I don't know how these people are like elders and doing this work. Right. And I think for me, that's really where it started. And at that point, I had no understanding that healing justice was even a framework that was being dreamed about by other movement leaders. So I think that's really where it started. And then as the universe does, it kind of all just landed on my lap and people were like, hey, do you want to lead our healing justice work? I guess, but I don't really know what it is, but I guess I can. We can figure it out. And so, yeah, so I think that's kind of like how I started doing this work in that sense. And then also in 2018 is actually when I was burned out. I was ready to transition from my position working with young people. And that's also when like me and Nova Ren and other folks here locally, we were like, hey, let's start a healing collective, see how it goes, see how it happens. And that was really the beginning, I feel, of what we couldn't even have imagined, right, of what could be possible.
Reference points are so real. Like, I feel like I want to tell like our story and, our whole story as much as possible, but I don't think I would add anything else to it. I think one thing that we should touch on, which is important, and Grisanti hinted towards it, is this idea of doing our own work in a way that creates us, makes us available to like greater work for others. I think oftentimes, at least a few folks that I see, they're really embedded in, like, for me, the gutter and the trenches, the days in and out of real work with folks burn out, and they burn out significantly because their stuff and others' stuff just crashes. You know what I mean? So I think there's something to be said, and I appreciate Grisanti bringing that piece up that should be touched on because it's real out here.
Maybe people can't make the connection between why community healing is an important role in public safety and criminal justice reform. Can you kind of flesh out why you make those connections and how you make those connections in the work that you do?
For me, that's an interesting question because a lot of my work is so private and sacred, you know what I mean? Like to the person that's literally across the seat from me. So oftentimes I view this sort of work from like the individual perspective, you know what I mean? And when folks are coming to me, there is a level, for example, of burnout. And that's what we process. So I don't know, Grisanti, like maybe you can hop into that and I can come again in on the back end.
LisaMarie, can you repeat your question, or can you bottom line your question?
There's so many, like, people I think are confused around what can we do, right? How can we heal communities, and why do we need to heal communities, and why this moment is important, and the things that people have been through and how that affects everyone else around them. So just to kind of step back into this space of, okay, let's ground this conversation again. Let's ground this in real life, in like the context of our current society, create a narrative around why this is important work and why it deserves more space and more light.
I think for me is because of white supremacy, because of these systems, we tend to somehow be against each other in the work. And I see this a lot in organizations, right? This competitive nature, even in like advocacy spaces. So I think part of why community healing is important in movement work is actually because we can't survive without it. It's actually because that is what is killing us and killing our movements, right? Particularly like in the city, the region where we live, it is very conservative. It is very much folks here will not bend backwards. By these folks, I mean people in office will not bend backwards or for the communities they're meant to serve. You know, they're not going to be aligned with really like these abolition frameworks that we need to be in a space where like everyone can be free. And we know we probably won't see that vision. Like I know I probably won't see that vision. Any of us probably like on this podcast will not see this vision. And it's also like what we need to keep reminding ourselves of. And it's what young people actually remind us of all the time, right? So I remember when I started organizing, all the elders would tell us, why are you blocking this bus? Why are you doing this? All the policies we were pushing for, we were being challenged on. And I actually see a lot of that still today with like the organizers I get the privilege to support in their campaign. And so I think one of the reasons is really like survival, so that we can actually like survive, not just in the region, but I really think like in the world, right? So that we can actually be here for a long time and coach or support those organizers that are coming after us. I'll also share a story. So there was actually a police commission for police reform that was brought forward by like young people here in Fresno. And being in that space murdered so many of our souls, so many of our spirit, because we knew what we were pushing for was going to sit in this book of recommendations and be taken advantage of, which is what's happening today, what's happening currently with our like city budget. And what really kept us alive in that space as much as we could was really like the support we had for one another, you know, chatting it up and really being real, even though most of us wanted to quit. And then the elders in the space really like reminding us that they had been fighting for this for like 30 plus years.
For me, it just goes back to folks, regardless of where they're at in community work, need to center their own work in the process. You know what I mean? I can't imagine, for example, for me, if I hadn't worked through my pain coming up, for example, having to like not only go to school, but then have to be the translator. And not that's like a pain that I didn't take on, but it is a real level of pain. And I think about like, what if I hadn't seen what the purpose, the rhyme and reason for that was? Could I enter any sort of work, right? Until literally taking care of my stuff is important. You know, again, I'm adjunct. Like I give mad props to Grisanti and folks out here because it's rough in terms of a larger scale community healing process. So, you know, for me being adjunct and kind of just zooming out and looking at things, a lot of like, I think what I see and experience, and I think Grisanti touched a little bit on this in her comments, is I do question people's individual like work and how far they've come or not when they become leaders, right? Because how I came up was there wasn't one single individual leader in the work, right? In the healing work. It was everybody brought something to the table and left that like hurt and pain that was detrimental to the process at the door. But they brought a healthy version of themselves and their pain in order to prop up the work. For me, healing work really, really comes down to like how down and how willing are we to consistently take care of our stuff, be aware of our stuff, to make sure that it doesn't get in the way in unhealthy fashions, to really, really prop people up and prop communities up.
Yeah, I think the work that you do on the individual scale, I know you think like, oh, well, I'm adjunct, but I really feel, and I feel strongly about this, that all of my therapist friends are doing such important work. It's so relevant to the moment that we're in. And I don't know if y'all are feeling this vibe too, but a lot of the entertainment and media is about generational healing and about generational trauma. So I feel like it's a really relevant moment right now that we're kind of seeing these two different narratives play out. We have folks that are becoming more invested in their own healing and healing of their family lines and their lineage. And we're also seeing like this white supremacist right-wing force that pounds it down, right? Or like we're seeing all these people, these sheriffs in LA, we're seeing the DA recalls in San Francisco and all these different places, and it's just like, it just feels like we're in a really important moment. Like we're almost at a crossroads of like, what do we want and what can we all inclusively build together, and like, what has the status quo been, right? A lot of the violence and disruptions that we've already seen this system unleash on, how can we put a stop to that? Yeah, the role of therapy and like what you're saying is really important. I feel like those two things are not separate. There's a lot more overlap than people might credit.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, as you're speaking, you know, the other thing that comes up to me is this idea of or not, right? Like literally or not, meaning maybe it's okay that there are these extreme sides, because for me, the work really is the middle. When I think about what folks are doing to survive right now versus the funding that's going into what one side or the other believes people are doing to survive is completely different, right? Like I think about like my mom and folks, and if somebody would have just been a fly on the wall to see what they did literally to survive, and how creative and intuitive they were to their own process versus what the system believed would work, right? I think one of the gaps, I hope this makes sense, but I think one of the gaps that's missing is, at least here in our city, and Grisanti, you can also kind of check me here too, but I think the piece that our city struggles is we have leaders that are propped in positions that are almost like gods, right? Because they haven't completed their work. They haven't shuffled through like, you know, their little internal work. And they come only representing, my gosh, I wouldn't even know what the percentage is, but they definitely ain't representing the masses. So I think about like the folks that are in the middle that are being creative, the communities that are being creative, and how do we get them not become their voice, but how do we get them, granted a whole bunch of pardon my language, I'm probably gonna cuss, but a whole bunch of shit is going on as to why folks don't wanna, you know what I mean, come out. But these people are surviving. We are surviving. And it doesn't take a lot of financial like support really to survive out here. Like, I hope that kind of guides us in a way, but yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and I feel like the more access you have to the tools you might need to heal, you're like, you know, like I see that so often. Like the people that are being underserved in the gaps, right? Those are the communities that we need to continue building access to these frameworks. Grisanti, in our briefing, we talked about healed people healing people. What does that mean to you, to both of you? And how have you seen that in your personal journeys and in your journey helping to like heal lineages and healing the collective?
Yeah. What does that mean to me? It means a lot of things. But I think I'll make a quick comment on the last part and then I'll move to this part. I've just been reflecting on like when there is, right, someone that just has a lot of energy and can be seen as abrasive or like violent in their words. We know like under that, there's so much pain, there's so much hurt, there's so much like misunderstanding that exists under that. Because I think when I was a teenager, I just slapped people, you know, and I just like lash out on people and I like walk out on people. So like when people look at the current version of me, they're like, oh, but you're so nice. How could that be you? It's like, because there was all this stuff happening in my life, you know? So I think for me, heal people. For me, it's really about like the grace and the modeling like we offer for ourselves and each other. What does it actually look like to like support someone that is in that place, right? It's really about being a mirror to them and really supporting them through that process with like questions, with like support, with checking in. Even when we're not healed, right? We're met with a lot of like suspicion when someone actually cares. We're like, wait a minute, why do you care? You know, like, why are you telling me to slow down? Why are you like checking in on me every day? What is this love you're giving me? And I think a lot of like my journey has been to actually step into accepting that love, because I also think that's a big part of it, of actually like accepting that support, accepting that love, and knowing that we're not going to make it on our own, despite like what we have been taught. Or I use a nice statement, like I was taught that like crying was weakness. You don't cry in public. You don't tell people like what happens in your home. You don't tell people your traumas, And I think what I have found through my journey is actually that's a form of connection. How are we actually like connecting with one another? I think where I am right now is also how do we also be in our bodies? And I think that's scary for people. It's scary for people to like be in our bodies, listen to our bodies, and actually let our body speak what like we can put into words. And I think that has been the scariest thing for most people, because a lot of the, not just like our pain, but really like the pain of our lineage really comes to the front. My mom has a lot of hip pain, and a few years ago I started noticing that I had a lot of hip pain. And I was like, wait a minute, where is this coming from? And it was really coming from the shame that my mom felt of kind of like the body, like dysmorphia that she kind of like projected mainly on me more than my siblings. And I think it was really that moment, of really like interrogating that and starting to ask her questions like, oh, where did this start? Okay, you had to marry really young. Okay, you didn't grow up with a mother. So like you were scared. You didn't know how to like mother us because you never had that example. So I think it's really like a lot of like noticing and interrogating, right? Like what are we seeing in ourselves that we see like in our mom, our dad, our sister, our lineage? And how do we actually like sit, interrogate that, and ask the questions we need to ask? And a lot of people are like, oh, well, who do I talk to about this? And my response is always like, well, you can find someone. You need to talk to a therapist. But really for my mom, so the entry point for my mom was one of our healing clinics. She did acupuncture, but that's where my mom started. Now she has a therapist. Now she's trying to be a massage therapist. So what are the small entry points that we all can make to like healing together in community that help us like really step into our own journey that, as Gade said, right, it's like scary and it's hard and we don't want to do it because we have been taught we have to do it alone and in isolation, but really like we can do it together.
Yeah, I'm just gonna drop the mic.
I can I'm gonna build off that a little because I agree. I feel like connection definitely happens when you're talking about what your experiences have been. And like people are afraid of that kind of darkness, I think. Like they're afraid to explore it and they're afraid of what might come out of Pandora's box, right? And the way this looks for me is like my dad was systems impacted like for a good 20 years of his like young adult life. When I was 5, he like got out of jail for the last time, and he's been like a good father. But it's not without its challenges, right? When your parent has been in the system for that long, there are noticeable differences in like who they are and who they could have been had they had the resources they needed, right? And I think about the young man my dad was and why he turned to substances and why he was like committing crimes is because he was going through a lot and his dad had just died and like all of it was just a spiral, right? And like when people get sucked into that spiral of like incarceration, it's traumatizing and there's shame and there's guilt and there's darkness and there's like a lot to deal with. And then when that gets passed down, now I have that. And I'm like, I think this is my entry point is unlearning I guess like the shame or the guilt and like learning to heal and to take that and carry that into my family in particular. I come from a big family, I might have said. So yeah, I think that's how I'm connecting and how I've stayed connected. And that's kind of my guiding star is like, I think back to that young version of my dad and I'm like, okay, if this kid was sitting in front of me right now, what would they need? What would they need? How can this kid be supported and like to avoid whatever might unravel in the future?
No, that's good. As both of y'all are talking, I think about healing it's messy. And if I'm being real, I don't know that there's one right way to go about it. I think there are some things that work. One of them being connection, and a healthy form of connection to community. But healing is messy. And I think we have to be willing with the right support to go to the more shadowy parts of ourselves and shadowy parts, I think, that are projected on like community as well, and just look at that stuff. I think the word that Grisante used was, like, if I remember, like, get curious, but also notice. I think it was notice that Grisante said, just notice. Real talk, and I see this all the time and I get it. It's scary to notice, and it's scary to be curious, especially of like the shadowy stuff, right? The shadow stuff, because I think what we've been taught globally is don't go to that side, right? When the fact of the matter is, and I see this and I hear this a lot, is when we go to that like darker, shadowy side and we just like put some light on it, not do anything else initially, but just put some light on it, it's actually not as scary as our brains and our bodies make it out to be. I think just this idea that it is okay to have struggles, challenges, mess as we get better, quote unquote. And I'm a believer in this, and I see this quite a bit in just like the folks that I work with, is that there's no arrival point. You know what I mean? Like, just because you've spotted this one part of yourself that is scary, and you have this great solution that'll work, it shouldn't be about that solution working more than it is what do you need to make sure that like this part of yourself is ever like available to you so that you can check in, right? I think one of the challenges, and this is a big assumption of mine, but just in community work and healing, especially like in the leadership role, is we tuck away those shadow parts. And sometimes rightfully so, right? But a leader that has done his or her work or their work doesn't tuck away the shadow, right? Is able to process it and use it in a way to be available and present for folks. I don't know about y'all, but the people that I know that know how to survive, they're almost always looking for that survival mode. They sniff it out in us anyways, right? Like that's where like fronting and faking and those kind of terminologies come from, is because they smell it like right off top. Like we know what it is, right? So I think there's a level of like presence that we have to be okay with. And I know I'm like probably beating a dead horse at this point, but for me, community work really is about the individual work and consistent awareness, consistent taming of like your individual stuff so that you can be available. Like, I think one of the dope things that Grisante said early on, and I hope people hear this, is here's where I was a few years ago, and this is why I was there, right? This is why I was burnt out, but look at where I'm at now, right? Like folks need to see the process of each of us like unfolding as appropriate as possible. So
I'm thinking back to our introductions, and y'all are like, this is what I do, but this is who I am. This is like who I am as a person. This is who I am holistically. And I think about that often, is like everyone is everyone. We're all messy human beings. Everyone wants to be perceived for who they are entirely. And I see like incarceration as being like a censor to that, where now we're censoring ourselves and we're censoring our bodies and we're censoring our communication and we're censoring our relationships. Moving on a little to community care. What role does community currently play?
What's already happening in community that like we're caring for each other, There's nothing new under the sun. There isn't, especially in communities where like it's heavily us, right? Like immigrant communities, like care is already happening.
Mm-hmm.
Funding, that's a whole nother piece, but care is happening already. So if it's okay, maybe I'd like to throw it out there like that to us as a group, like what's already happening so we can elevate that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Grisante?
Yeah, I mean, so there are two examples that came to mind, mainly because I'm mainly like in conference spaces with like young people and organizers. So the example I always give them is like, you give like water to each other, you give tea to each other, you see what y'all need. And that within itself is like community care. You see like someone struggling, y'all step in and y'all are like, don't worry, I'll go first while you think about it, And I think the other example is through the pandemic, we actually started the Central Valley Mutual Aid Network here, particularly when the government was like, if you're undocumented, you're not getting a stimulus check, right? So that was really like our focus. And it was really a lot of hood kids, right? Like coming together, asking community, hey, if you could spare, donate your stimulus check to like farm workers that have no job right now or at risk every single day. So I think that is, for me, such a beautiful example. And I think what this pandemic that we're currently in, it brought a lot of bad stuff, but it actually also like grounded us in each other, was that it expanded the way that we think about mutual aid. I feel like something has happened in our world where now you can request mutual aid for different things. I feel there was some shame attached to it in the past where it was like, nah, I could take care of my stuff. Like, I don't need help for nobody. And I feel now, as more like mutual aid networks started arising, if people are like, oh, I need support on this, I need support on this, it's easier for us to actually step into that as a unit than it was in the past. So I think those are like two examples that are like super like close to my heart, and that I feel are in practice of like abolition and like transformative justice and like community care for one another.
Another question I have, and I feel like you tied this in perfectly, is how folks can get involved or begin working on building those transformative justice and restorative justice muscles.
I feel like I take it back to the therapy container and say, as corny as it sounds, like it really does start with us on an individual level, like recognizing your needs, recognizing what your concerns are. And then, like the old school folks say, and for me, I came up around a bunch of elders that were like, understand your lane and understand that it's okay to stay in your lane, because the more lanes that we have that come together, like things work out for us. So I'd say those two things.
Yeah, I like that. Stay in your lane. Definitely do that. I think as I was doing work, I realized hard advocacy, was not for me. All these rooms with white folks, right, that are making decisions for students. I think that's the moment where I realized where I was, oh, these people are tiring me out. And I think that's when I really realized that really like my lane was like healing, and really bringing healing to like movement. That this was back in like 2015. So, we're in a better place now as a movement. Yeah. I mean, how do you do that? I think you just dream up, find your crew, but like find a good crew, know how to navigate conflict would be like my advice. Find the resources to do that, because I think that is another big part, right? Where we just don't know how to be in conflict with each other. Something happens and it's like, I never want to see you again, but how do we actually be in conflict and see it as a generative way where we don't always have to agree, but we can actually like still be on this boat for liberation. Adrienne Maree Brown, who's a doula, an author, all these beautiful things, right, actually said in a podcast once that we don't have to get there on the same boat. Like we won't get there together, but we will all arrive. So how do we just like hold on to that, right? Especially as we know folks from my community, right? Like some of them are actually pro-police. They're like, no, police is safety to me. So how do we actually, slowly bring them along with us and not like leave them behind? And also don't allow them like shut down our visions as well. And then also find if like, say, you're trying to do something, see if someone in your community is already doing that and you can actually join in, right? Rather than like starting from like the ground up, right? Like, and I think that's the thing with being in healthy conflict together, right? Like if there's something that's happening and we can kind of like support in that, do that, rather than like starting like something new, unless, it's really like a big need and you feel like your heart is going to be there, because if not, you're just going to burn out really quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, Grisanti. Thank you for that. Something that you said about knowing your lane and how healing work is important to you. I believe in the dual power structure, so like there are people in the inside and they're reforming and they're doing their thing and we align in areas and we disalign in others. And then there are people that are on the outside that are in community that's the dual power structure I'm talking about, like the mutual aid, the like community care and those elements, alternatives to 911. Those things are in tandem with one another, really, right? And I feel like instances where I've been in disalignment with folks in the movement space, it's all love, right? And it's like, okay, maybe at this exact moment in time on this issue, you're going to do your thing, I'm going to do my thing, you're going to stay in your lane, I'm going to stay in my lane. And then we come together for like in the future, right? And I feel like ability for people to transform and to change over the years is something that we should never like undervalue or underappreciate?
This is how the work starts. More words, I guess, for me would be, I think folks should absolutely be vigilant about like rest and recovery, especially in this work that we do, at the cost of everything else. You have to be vigilant about this process if you want to be available for folks. I think that's important. And just keep going. Little steps are better than big steps, in my opinion. You know what I'm saying? So progress is all about just, moving, but rest in that somehow, some way.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation today. If you take anything, I'll share a quick 1-minute story. So when I took my sabbatical, which I took it last year for 3 months, I actually was reminded that the work is always going to be here. There's always going to be a fire to rescue. Our vision is blurred when we're not rested, when we're just on the grind. And trust me, that grind is going to catch up to you. Focus on your rest, interrogate like your healing, like your lineage, like know your lane, whatever that is. Maybe it's like just being a good titi, a good like aunt, maybe it's like our next actual good politician. Whatever that looks like for you, just stay grounded and trust in the universe.
Thank you for the time. I'm with Grisanti. I appreciate it. It's going to be neat to see what comes out of this and where folks take it. And hopefully it's a conversation,
Right, an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for guiding us through this. Thank you both.
Thank you, LisaMarie, for conducting today's interview. As someone who has worked on advocacy around stopping the school-to-prison pipeline and criminal justice reform, I'm also someone who is familiar with the journey from hurt to healing. And your discussion really resonated with me and likely many of our listeners. So as promised at the start of this episode, let's revisit and maybe rethink the images we hold about what a crime victim or a perpetrator might look like, because they can look like and be the same person. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Drop a line and join the conversation by tagging us at CourageCA and using the hashtag Courage Looks Good on You. I'm your host, Angela Chavez, and this has been Courage, It Looks Good on You. We hope you join us for part 2 of our criminal justice reform and public safety discussion. Healed people heal people. So tune in next time, California, because we're just getting started. And if you like this podcast, please rate it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from, and of course, share.